everyone, my name is Kristen and welcome if you happen to click on this video. I got some requests recently to go over how I studied for patho as well as some nursing style questions. So I figured the best way to just talk about how I studied for every class that I've been in is to just individually go through each course and talk about the nursing style questions that go along with each of the courses. I was thinking about doing one long video for nursing style questions, but I just feel like, at least for me, it just makes more sense if I do those nursing style questions within the specific topic it goes with, because every course will be different on which have nursing style questions and which ones will have just knowledge-based questions. So if you are interested in wanting to learn how to study for pathophysiology, let's go ahead and dive in and I will tell you how I study. Break down how the class is, what it's about, what days I went to class, just so you have a better understanding of how my study plan was. Pathophysiology is essentially the study of a disease process, what the disease is, why it might happen, who is at more risk, so what risk factors are associated, what the clinical manifestations might be, or just generally what are the signs and symptoms, and then how can we treat that condition. Now I have that class Wednesdays and Fridays. It was about 2 to 2.5 hours long. Some days my professor would start a new topic and sometimes she would utilize both days to discuss one topic if there was a lot of detail within a specific concept. So essentially the way that I started studying for this class, so I'm kind of just going to break it down by what I did during lecture, then what I did at home, and then I'm going to go into the nursing style questions you may see in a pathophysiology exam. So my professor would give us the PowerPoints ahead of time, and what works best for me is by handwriting. So I would print out the PowerPoints before class. Now, if you do like typing out your notes, I would just suggest to utilize the PowerPoint on your computer and just type that way. I know that's just as easy as handwriting, but I just prefer to write everything out, and I would always bring the PowerPoints to class with me. So I would essentially write all over the PowerPoint. It's so messy. It's just, I would try to keep it as neat as I could, but my professor just talked so quickly that I was just writing all over the page. Like, she even wrote out little diagrams for us. So I literally just try to follow my professor during class. If it wasn't on the PowerPoint, I wrote it down, and I would try to make sure not to write anything down that was already on the PowerPoint. And I know as crazy as that sounds, sometimes I would catch myself doing that because she just kept talking and I wouldn't even realize she was reading right off the slides. So, and I would also highlight anything that she may have stressed multiple times. And I even utilized just flashcards in this class as well. So if I noticed that my professor was saying things again and again and again, or she used a different tone, which took me a little bit to figure out, but you would know, like, she changed the tone in her voice when she was trying to stress the importance of a topic. I just lost my train of thought. But anyway, so like, I would definitely try to write things down on flashcards whenever she would repeat herself, just so I could go home and immediately commit those to memory. Now, when it came to highlighting, and I have a highlighted piece right here. Like I said, anything that she kind of discussed multiple times and essentially said, well, you need to know this, I would just quickly go ahead and highlight that. So when it came to taking notes in class, I didn't put too much effort, and honestly, my notes in class are messy. I would never study off of this. It is just to make sure that I get all the information in class down on one piece of paper, so then when I go home, I will implement a new study technique. And I'm not gonna lie, that's pretty much all that I did for lecture. I normally will read the book before class, but for pathophysiology, I just could not get myself to read the text. There was just so much information we did not need to know. I'm sometimes horrible at picking out what information's important and what information's not. So for me, I just felt like this was a course that I really just needed to go to the class and listen to what the professor thought was important before I even thought about diving into that book. Now, my professor actually gave us access to some test questions as well. We did have to do quizzes throughout the semester. So when it even just came time to doing practice questions in the book, I wouldn't even focus honestly on the book even for practice questions. I mainly just utilized the resources that my professor gave me Honestly, she was a fabulous professor and I couldn't have asked for a better professor, so I think I just happened to get really lucky when it came to my professor. So I did always make sure I was recording the lectures, and my professor did give us permission. Anytime I was in class, I made sure to record them, and anytime I got home, I would make sure to come home and re-listen to that lecture. Now, the lectures were about 2 hours, so I would sometimes listen to them the night I got home from lecture, and I would listen to the full 2.5 hours, or I would break it up in 2 days. So I didn't have class on Thursdays, so if I had my lecture on Wednesday, I would come home Wednesday night, listen to the 2.5 hours, or if I didn't want to do that, I would listen to like one half of the lecture, and because I didn't have class on Thursdays, I would listen to the rest of the lecture on Thursday. And it was really nice to just have that break because I was able to have the time to go back and listen to the lecture. Now, most of the times I picked up most of what the professor had already said, but I know some individuals may learn auditory, so this is actually a great way to study, even if you already got all the important information down on paper. And for me, it just really helps solidify those concepts. So if I was really confused on something, really just hearing it a second time really helped. Now, after listening to the lecture, if there was something that I was very, very confused about and still didn't understand my professor explaining it to me, I would turn to registered nurse RN. Now, she has so many videos on YouTube. Every specific concept that I went over had a video about it. She just does such a great job at condensing the information that you need to know for NCLEX and really just implementing different learning styles. So if you learn best with mnemonics, oh, don't you worry. She has tons of mnemonics for you to learn for specific concepts that she goes over. So I really utilized her videos, and I did take the time to watch them. Sometimes I know, for example, the stroke video or even like heart failure, those ones were very long, like I think at least 30 minutes long. So I really did make sure that I watched from start to finish, and that was just another way for me to get through a concept and reinforce it. And she does a lot of visuals as well, and like I said, I'm a very visual learner, so this really helped for me to just watch somebody else teach the material just from a different perspective. Sometimes that's all we need to be able to really understand the concept. Now, what I actually implemented starting from the first exam is whenever I got all the information that I needed, I actually would write out my notes. And I would only do this whenever I felt comfortable enough with all the concepts and made sure that I had every piece of information that I needed, just because I do like to write in pen and I don't want to have to miss anything and have to go back and try to like squeeze it in a very small space. So I just make sure that I have everything I need before I get started. Right now, I'm just flipping through my binder so you can see what my notes look like. I do just want to point out that it did take me anywhere from 4 to 8 hours to handwrite out one PowerPoint, and that's just because I really was trying to learn the information as I was writing out my notes. Now, if you think about it, my professor did give us 1 to 2 PowerPoints a week, so I would study anywhere from 8 hours, maybe all the way up to 16 hours a week for pathophysiology, but I did split it up anywhere from 1 to 3 hours a day, and I did take 1 day off during the week where I did no schoolwork. Now, the style of note-taking pretty much stayed the same throughout the whole semester. It wasn't until towards the end of the semester that I stuck to a specific outlining method. I was pretty much outlining throughout the whole semester, and I was even utilizing graphs and charts. So my professor was always utilizing charts, images, graphs, and I would always make sure anything she gave us in class ended up in my notes because I knew that was important. So this example right here is just acid-base imbalances, and it was her shortened version of how to make the information easier to understand. And so I would always make sure I include these. And what I would do for specific disease processes, it really just depends. Whatever I felt like doing with my notes that day, like I said, most of the time it would just be an outline, which I will go ahead and link my how I take notes video, because a lot of that is pretty much all that I did for pathophysiology. Sorry y'all, my battery died on my camera and I had to switch positions because I'm starting to lose light now. But I was just saying that anytime my professor utilizes specific graphs, charts, I would make sure those ended up in my notes. And depending on the disease process, if it made more sense to me to learn it this way, like acid-base imbalance, I would actually create a chart. So I would put the actual imbalance on one side, and then I would go from left to right and write about what it is, what are the signs and symptoms, what are the interventions, what are the treatments. I would highly suggest to do that for your fluid imbalances, your electrolyte imbalances, your acid-base imbalances. Doing charts and graphs like that is so useful to be able to distinguish what the important factors are for each condition. Now, just to give you an idea of what my outlines might look like I said, it did really change from the beginning to the end of the semester, so this is a little bit different than that how I take my notes video is, but it's just an outline, and I would still follow the same thing, still color-coded, still everything like that, but it would really just depend on how I was going to outline my notes that day, what made more sense to me. Most of the time, I would follow my professor's study guide. So she would give us questions like, this just happens to be the respiratory disorder that I'm looking at right now. And one of her questions was, what are the 3 functions of the respiratory system? So I would write underneath that question, just the 3 functions, 1, 2, 3. So ventilation, perfusion, and diffusion. So that pretty much summed up what I needed to know about that specific topic. And just another example, just to give you an idea, she literally just gave us these pages with questions on it. So one of the questions was, what are the most common causes of hypoxia? And so you'll just know that hypoxia is just a decrease in tissue oxygenation, if I can speak correctly. And I kind of just talked about all the different factors that will actually contribute to hypoxia and what the signs and symptoms are. So I'll try my best to group all the information that goes with each other together, just so when I'm studying, everything is just cohesive and makes sense. I know towards the beginning of the semester, my notes may have been a little bit more scattered. It just took me a minute to really find my groove to be able to get it to the way I like my notes. Let me just show you a few more examples of how I would have used a chart, just to give you an idea of how resourceful these charts actually are and how much easier your studying can be just by putting the information side by side. So these are all the conditions that go and are categorized with anemia. So literally you have 8 different conditions that are very similar. So just really putting the pathogenesis, the diagnostic criteria, the clinical manifestations, and treatment options right on one page. Just really summarize it to what makes you understand it best, and just put it in a chart like this will help you memorize the information a lot quicker, and you'll actually be able to pull out the important details that you'll need to know just for each specific condition. I also did a chart when I was comparing and contrasting chronic bronchitis and emphysema because they're similar but different. So I really just wanted to make sure that I was able to see the similarities and differences, and it's the same thing. I did the pathogenesis, etiology, the characteristics, clinical manifestations, and treatment. But as you can see, I also still implemented the outline method, and that's just because my professor had these study guide questions, and I really just wanted to make sure that all the information that I had for each was in one place. And sometimes I would answer the question just by putting a graph and a chart, and that is just what helps me understand the information. Now, after all my notes were done, I would make sure my notes were done at least 5 to 7 days before the actual exam. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, especially with how quickly some of these classes go, but you really do need to make sure that you know this information before you get to the exam, because pathophysiology was one of those that we did have application-based questions. And if you didn't know that information and you were cramming the last 2 days, I promise it would not stick in my brain. And so I really just got into a routine where all my notes were done, like I said, at least 5 to 7 days. And all I did was study from my notes. So all the notes that I have in this binder for pathophysiology is all I needed to study for the exam when it came to looking at the information. Now, when it came for preparing for test questions, so I do have a couple resources that I utilized, and I'm just gonna go through them really quickly. Now, my professor did make us buy an access code. Now, I know I talked about this just a little bit earlier in this video, but essentially what she did was she counted some of our grade was these quizzes that we did online that coincided with each chapter that we were discussing at that time. So this actually corresponds to the specific book that my professor decided to choose to teach from in the class. And each chapter has its own pre-quizzes, post-test, application-based style questions, knowledge check questions, and I would utilize all those practice questions. Now, I probably, for each chapter, if there was about 4 to 5 chapters on an exam, I would probably do about 100 questions per chapter. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but you also have to think a lot of these questions are very similar. So sometimes you really just start going through them very quickly because you've seen that material so many times before. They can only ask a question so many different ways. You have to think about it that way. And I would utilize the quizzes that she gave us and all that extra material that came with Evolve. And just to give you a quick little rundown, so Evolve is something you may see in the future if you're in nursing school. Normally, if you buy a book that happens to be associated with Evolve, you get online resources with that book. So it just gives you like extra practice questions. It may also give you like different concept maps, different case studies, different videos you can watch. So it's just an extra resource for you to utilize on top of the resources you may already have. So a lot of the times doing these Evolve questions is what I utilize to study for the exam. I would then, if I felt like I needed more studying, which most of the time I normally felt pretty comfortable by this point, but sometimes I would actually take an Evolve question, I would copy it and put it into Google, and then I would look up different Quizlets to just get some different style questions within the same chapter I may be studying. So I just want to throw a disclaimer out there. Sometimes Quizlets may not have the correct answer. So just know that if you're studying from a Quizlet, which I think are very beneficial for you to study from just to get different practice questions, but just know the answer may not always be correct unless there's like a rationale, and sometimes you may not even want to believe 100% just because these are individuals who are putting study things together, and it may not always be 100% correct. But I do utilize Quizlet just because sometimes you may see a question on an exam that's very similar, and Quizlet can sometimes just be a helpful resource for me as well. And I am putting together Quizlets for each of the classes, so once I do, I'm gonna go ahead and start linking those down below as well, just to give you some extra practice in your classes if you feel like you need some extra help. I would also utilize my NCLEX examination book. So this is just a comprehensive review. I would go through the book to see if there was any sections on anything pathophysiology related. Now, I do know that they literally do have a fluid and electrolyte and acid-base imbalance section in here, so I obviously read this book from front to back with each of those sections, and it's just such a great Cliff's Notes version if you feel like you need that. But this book does a great job at just breaking down the information and really help making it easier for you to understand. And honestly, other than just utilizing my professor as a resource if I had any additional questions, that is pretty much all that I did. So before I get started in talking about what the kind of nursing style questions you will see on a patho exam, I will just let you know I am going to give you a few examples just for your knowledge. So when it came to test day, the kinds of questions that you'll see are 1, knowledge-based. And these are just the questions that are like, what is a sign or symptom of the electrolyte imbalance hyperkalemia? So this is just high potassium, and you really just need to know what the sign and symptoms are. So if you memorize the signs and symptoms, you are able to answer that question. And the second kind of question that you will see on a pathophysiology nursing exam is application-based. So I'm gonna go back to the hyperkalemia example that I did for the knowledge base just to help you have a better understanding of what the difference might be in the questions. So I'm gonna give you a patient scenario that you're normally gonna have to read in a very short amount of time. So a 60-year-old patient who's a female comes into the emergency department complaining of abdominal cramping, diarrhea, maybe some muscle weakness, and you do an EKG on her because you're trying to figure out what's wrong, and the EKG shows an elevated peak T wave. So upon assessment of the patient, what do you think could be going wrong with this individual? Now, you're not the provider, so you're not going to be diagnosing them, but when you're going through your assessment, you want to start picking up these clues as to possibly what the individual might be suffering from. Well, I gave you a few examples of some signs and symptoms of hyperkalemia. That's abdominal cramping, diarrhea. I even threw in muscle weakness, and the major factor that really tells you if it's hyperkalemia, at least this is what my professor really stressed in us, is that peak T wave on the EKG. as you can see, like, you really not only needed to know the signs and symptoms, but to even take it a step further and make it a true application-based question, they would then ask, instead of just asking like, what might the patient be suffering from, they may say, what would be your recommendation for treatment? So they didn't even give you what hyperkalemia was. You had to figure out what it was based off of the signs and symptoms in the evaluation from the question. And then you have to know, okay, if I have a patient that has hyperkalemia, what am I gonna do for treatment? Then you start thinking in your head all these treatment options that you could possibly do, and then you have to choose the best response. Sometimes you may be given all 4 correct are great treatment options, but you need to know which one is the most correct. So you always want to think back to what may put my patient at more risk. Whatever my patient is at more risk for, that's the first thing that I have to do to be able to treat the patient. So you always need to make sure that you're prioritizing these treatment plans whenever you're going through different interventions. Just know which one may be priority over another, because sometimes you will see priority questions in these application-based style questions. And probably what I would say is the last kind of nursing style question you would see on a pathophysiology exam. And you may not even see it as much. You'll probably see this more in like foundations and med surg, but I just want to throw this out there in case your professor does do these kinds of style questions. And these are the higher level thinking questions. I feel like these higher level kinds of questions are more so when you go through like a case study, which none of my professors so far have given us case study questions like this. I do remember in patho, my professor did ask us a case study style of question, and I think it was 2 questions in a row, so it wasn't anything major. It was pretty much these knowledge-based questions with an application-based question. But I do just want you to be aware and to start looking into some of these higher level questions, because I feel like this may be a question that is important on NCLEX and may not be as important in undergrad. If I can think of one for patho, I will go ahead and insert it here, but I just right now can't think of any because, sorry, that's my upstairs neighbor. I just can't think of any because a lot of the questions on my pathophysiology exam, I'm not gonna lie, were pretty much knowledge-based. What I can say though is you will see a lot of select all that apply. So you may have a question very similar to the first knowledge-based question that I asked you. What are the signs and symptoms of hyperkalemia? So instead of just picking out one, you're now going to have to sift through a whole bunch of answer choices and pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of them that coincide with signs and symptoms. So these are the ones that tend to trip students up most. You really have to make sure you're reading the question stem, because a lot of the times these questions will just throw in information that is just distractors that you do not need to know to answer the question. And I definitely will say that has probably tripped me up sometimes, and I will choose additional options that don't necessarily answer the question, but are A, true statement, or B, may relate to the scenario but is not explicitly stated. And you really want to make sure you're answering the question that is right in front of you. Don't overthink these questions. Don't add in any new material that's not in the question stem. Just answer what the question is asking. And that is pretty much all that comes with the select all that apply. If there's anything that I can tell you when taking these style of questions, especially when it comes to patho, really make sure you reinforce that information with NCLEX style test questions. And if there's anything I can say is just be confident. I know, as silly as that sounds, when you're going in an exam, you worked hard to get a good grade on this exam. You know the information. Don't second guess yourself. Most likely, 99% of the time, the first answer choice that you picked, your intuition brought you to that answer choice for a reason. So just know that if you're going back and forth and changing your answers, while I can say sometimes I've had changed an answer and it has been correct the second time, and that's just because I needed a minute to kind of think through the question, just know that most of the time your first answer will always be right. So don't second guess yourself, and really, really, really just be confident and know that the first answer that you pick is most likely the correct one. And that is pretty much all I can think of. Just to quickly recap, when you go to lecture, make sure you're taking notes, listening to your professor, take notes however you need to. Second thing, when you're studying, just make sure that you kind of simplify the notes however you need to, whether or not that's on PowerPoint, Word, or like me, handwrite your notes, or if you utilize an iPad, whatever, just make sure that you really make your notes your own. And then practice, practice, practice. I can't stress that enough. I know a lot of individuals talk about, oh, you need to look at your notes 7 times before the exam, or oh, you need to make sure that you're spending this amount of time before the exam. But honestly, practice questions are the biggest thing that help me know if I know the information or not. And sometimes utilizing these practice questions before really engaging in the material and studying can really help guide your studying as well. So you can do practice questions before, during, after. You can do practice questions just before. You can do practice questions after you've studied everything. Implement it how it works best for you, but I promise you will benefit from doing practice questions. I bet you 100% your grade will go up if you just utilize these practice questions. And I know for the future, when I do these different study tips for different classes, I do utilize different practice books. But for patho, like I said, I mainly just used my online Evolve resource. So if you want to know how I studied for different classes, just make sure that you stay tuned, because I am having kind of like a quote-unquote little series coming. So that is all that I have for you on how to study all things pathophysiology. So if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and please don't forget to subscribe. I also just want to say, if you have any suggestions, you know I love to hear them, or if you have any questions, you know you can ask me anything. I'm very open, so go ahead and just leave whatever you need to in the comment section down below. And of course, I just want to tell you, like always, good luck to you on your nursing journey.